Hi everyone, Sean Wassell here. In most websites that you use on a day-to-day basis, you're able to navigate around to different pages in the site. So you might have a home page, an about page, a profile page, a shopping cart page, a products page, a checkout page, and so on and so forth. You get the idea. Now, how do we build different pages in React, right? Is there a special concept for creating page components or something like that? Well, that's what we're going to take a look at in this course. We're going to see how to actually display different pages on different routes of a React application. So this is going to be done mainly using a package called React Router DOM, and that's one of the main things we're going to be seeing how to use. So in addition, we're going to be seeing how to do things like build a nav bar and add that to our application. We're going to see how to use things like URL and query parameters, and we'll also see how to navigate the user programmatically, that is, without them actually interacting with the site. So there's lots to cover here. Let's get going. Okay, so let's start talking about routing in React. Routing in React is basically when we have different components show up when the URL that's in our browser changes. Okay, so far we've just had a single page in our application. We've had just this one big long scrolling page that we basically use to display all of the content of our app, right? We've had the user profile and all of our friend cards on the exact same page. Now, normally this is not what we're going to want to do. So in our case, what we're going to want to do as we add more and more functionality to our application, which we're doing at a pretty good rate here, we're going to want to have several different pages that really help us separate the concerns of our application. So first of all, basically all of the work that we've put into the application so far, especially with our friend cards and saving favorites, that kind of stuff, we're going to want to move that into its own page, and we're going to call that the Friends page. Now, since the entire purpose of our application here is to track our friends and keep track of our favorites, all that kind of information, that kind of stuff, we're going to want this to be the main page of our application. So this one we're going to want to show up when we just go to the home route of our application. So basically, if we're running this locally, that'll mean we want that to show up when we just go to localhost 3000. Another page that we're going to create is going to be the user profile page. That's going to display the information for the currently logged in user. Right, that's the stuff that was showing up at the very top of our current application. So that one we're going to call the user profile page, and to do that, all right, we're just going to call this user profile page. And we're going to want this one to show up at a route that basically describes what the page is going to be. That's going to be something like /user profile. I'm just going to put that on another line here. And the third page that we're going to create here, we're going to start off by just creating 3 separate pages. The third page that we're going to create is going to be the friend detail page. So what we're going to want to have happen is whenever we click on one of those friend cards that we saw, we're going to want that to navigate us to a detail page very similar to the user profile page, except it will display the details of that individual friend. So we'll call that the friend detail page. Okay. And the way that that's going to work, that one's going to be a little different. It's actually going to be displayed at a route that looks like this. It's going to be /friends. And then it's going to be / and it's going to contain the ID of the friend that we want to display. Now, I'm going to show you how to do that when we actually get there and start creating our routes, but it'll look something like this, right? You'll have 123 if you want to see friend with the ID 123. It'll be 234 if you want to see another friend, and so on and so forth. That's something called URL parameters, which we'll talk about later on. Okay, so those are the 3 pages that we want to add to our application. Now, in order to actually implement routing in a React application, we need to install a separate package. So React, unlike Angular, doesn't provide routing out of the box in its core NPM package. What we need to do is install a package called React Router DOM. That's basically the package that contains all of the main components and other helper functions that allow us to add routing to our application. So let's say npm install, and again, the package is called React Router DOM. and we're going to hit enter, and that will install that package for us. So let's talk a little bit more about how this React Router DOM package is going to allow us to add routing to our application. Basically, all the routes that we're going to define are going to be inside our app component. This isn't a hard and fast rule, but generally routing is a higher up concern than what happens on each individual page, so it just tends to naturally fall into our app component here. Now, before we actually add the different routing components and define our routes, what we're going to do for now is just comment out all of the code that we have inside our app component. This might seem a little severe for now, but basically, as you'll see, what we're going to be doing later on is moving all of this logic into the friends page that I talked about. So this is no longer going to be app level logic. It's actually going to be put inside its own page that will worry about favorite IDs, toggling favorites, etc. You'll see what I mean when we get there. But basically what we're going to do now is add our routes, and the way that we're going to do that in a React application is using a few components that we import from the React Router DOM package we just added. So first of all, the two components that we're going to need to start off with are a component called Browser Router and a component called Route. Okay, and those are both imported from React Router DOM here. Now, the way that this works, this Browser Router component is basically going to wrap all of the other components inside our application. It's generally one of the highest, it's generally one of the highest up components in our application, right? It's the parent component of all parent components, generally speaking. So what that's going to look like, we're going to say Browser Router, and all of the other components that we display in our application are going to be inside this Browser Router. And what this thing actually is, it's what's called a provider. We're going to talk about those later on as well. But it's a provider, and it basically allows all of the components inside of it to access the URL that we're currently at in the browser. Okay, so we have that Browser Router, and before we define our routes, what I want to do is actually define some basic pages for our application. All we're going to do at this point is just stub those pages out, right? They're just going to have some kind of title or something at the top, just so that we can get our routing working, and then we'll actually move on to implement each individual page. Okay, so the way that we're going to create our pages in React applications are just components, the same as any of the other components we've created, right? So people list, person card, profile info. The pages that we're going to create are just components. There's nothing special that we do in order to designate them as a page besides display them on the top level in our app component. You'll see what I mean in just a second. So generally what I like to do, at least in smaller scale applications, is create a new folder called Pages. And this folder will contain all of the components that are pages in our application. Pretty straightforward, right? So let's create the rephrase. So let's start off by creating the three main pages that I talked about earlier. We're going to say new file, and inside here we're going to create our friend page. So friendspage.js. We're also going to create the user profile page, which is going to display the information for the current user. So user profile page.js. And last but not least, we're going to create the friend detail page. Okay, so that's going to, again, be when we click on a friend card, we want to go to a page where it shows us where it shows us their details in more depth, right? So we want to see their interests, their birthday, etc. Okay, so what we're going to do, as I said, is we're going to start off by creating just some basic stub components for each of these pages. Each of these pages is going to be pretty straightforward. We're going to start off by saying const, and then the name of the page, so friends page. And each of these pages isn't going to take any props. It's simply going to return some top-level JSX. And for now, that's just going to be a heading. For our friends page, we'll say something like, I'm the friends page. Okay, and then we're going to, of course, export that. So we're going to say export friends page. Next up, we're going to do our user profile page. That's going to look almost identical to what we just did in our friends page. So we'll say const user profile page equals no props here. And we're going to return an h1 heading that says I'm the user profile page. Okay, and then we're going to export that component. Export user profile page. And in the friend detail page, same story as before. We're going to say const friend detail page equals no props. And we're going to return, oops, let me remove that asterisk there. And we're going to say h1, I'm the friend detail page. Okay, and let's export this component. And note that we don't have to worry about prop types for these components since they don't really take any props. Okay, so that's something we don't have to worry about generally with page components or really any component that doesn't take any props. Cool, so we've got our 3 page components created. So the next thing that we're going to do is import them into our app component and define routes for each one of these. Okay, so up here at the top, we'll just put it right under where we import the browser router and route components. We're going to say import, and I usually like to try and keep this alphabetical somewhat. So we're going to start off by importing the friend detail page from pages friend detail page. We're going to also import the friend page, or friends page rather. And last but not least, we're going to import the user profile page. And those are our 3 page components. Now, I'm also going to comment out, well, everything except for this styles thing here, because currently, right, we basically commented out everything here that we were using. So, we're going to be moving this again into probably the friends page once we get there. But first, I want to set up the routes. And actually, the styles, now that I think about it, doesn't need to be there either. So we'll comment that out as well. Okay, so defining routes in React using React Router DOM is pretty simple. Basically, what we do is we put one route component for each different page we want to display, right, for each different route of our application. So we have 3 different pages. We're going to have 3 different routes. And each of these route components takes a single prop called path. And that path prop is basically the URL that we want to display the contents of this route at. So for our home route, it'll look just like that, okay? So we'll say route path equals /, and then what we do is inside the opening and closing tags of this route, we simply put whatever elements, whatever components we want to display when the current URL matches that path. So for our friends page, which is sort of our home page in this application, we're just going to say friends page, and since it doesn't take any props, we don't really need to worry about that too much. Okay, so next up, we're going to define probably our friend detail page, I suppose, and the route for that one is going to look a little bit different. So remember that I said basically what we want this route to look like is we want it to be /friends/ and then, you know, some ID of some sort. All right, so 1, 2, 3 or 2, 3, 4 or 3, 4, 5. And again, those are called URL parameters. We're going to go into more detail on how they work and how to use them shortly. But when we want to have a section of our path where the segment can have multiple values, right, such as what I just showed you, the way that we do that is by putting a colon before that, and then we can sort of pick a variable name, if you will. Right, so we're just going to say something like friend ID here for now. Again, we'll see how that works when we actually implement the friend detail page. All right, and then inside there, we're going to say friend detail page. We're just going to, oops, let me try that again. Friend detail page. That will display the friend detail page when we go to that route. And the final page that we're going to have here is going to be the user profile page, and as I said before, the path for this is going to be user-profile. And inside there, as you might have guessed, we're going to display the user profile page component. Okay? And as I said, these pages, as we saw, are just components, so in theory, we could display any kind of elements that we want inside these routes, right? So if instead of the friends page, we wanted to display just, some kind of heading here, like my friends. And if we wanted to display all of the other components that we wanted to put on that page inside of here, we could do that, right? There's not really any specific reason we have to create separate components for pages, besides the fact that it generally just makes our application much easier to maintain and organize. So that's why I generally do it, but I just want to emphasize that there's nothing special about these page components besides where we're displaying them. Okay, so let's run our application now. And we can also get rid of this use state hook for now, or at least comment it out. We'll move that into the friends page when we get there. So let's run our application by saying npm run start. This is if you haven't already run it. And that will open up our app on localhost 3000. And what we're going to see is only the friends page is being displayed right now, right? That's because we're at the home route of our application. So let's take a look at the user profile page, I guess. We're going to put in that URL, and you're going to see something that you might not have expected at this point. And I'll show you how to fix it. So if we go to /user profile, what we see is that our user profile page is actually displayed inside our browser, which is nice. However, so is our friends page, which is not so nice. Now, the reason for this, there's two things that I want to point out. First of all, routes in React are not exclusive. So in other words, it's possible for more than one route to match the current URL in our browser. And in those cases, what will happen is it will basically display the contents of both routes. So that's what's happening here that we're seeing. It's displaying both the friends page and the user profile page. Now, the next question is, why is this home route here, why is our friends page route matching when the URL is user-profile, right? That's a good question. Well, the reason for this is that by default, route matching in React Router DOM is done in a fairly relaxed manner, right? It's not super strict about what routes match, what routes don't. So essentially, the default way that React matches routes is it will just look to make sure that the contents inside the path of a route are contained in the current URL, right? So for user profile, this would not only match /user profile as we have here, but as you'll see, it would also match if we were to just put another slash and put a lot of extra stuff after that slash, right? It would basically match anything there because React only looks to make sure that the current route that we've put in the path is at the beginning of whatever route we're currently at in the browser. So the way that we can fix this, right, in situations like user profile, it doesn't really matter too much because generally users won't mess around with the URL anyway. But with our home route here, what we have to do is add a second prop to our route component, and that is a prop called exact. Okay, now what this exact prop does is it basically tells React the route needs to match exactly in order for us to display the contents of this route. Generally, we'll want to do that when two or more of our routes share the same beginning section. So for friends, for example, right? If this path were to be /friends, we would still have to put this exact prop on there because these two would both show up when we go to the friends detail page because they have the same, the same matching segment, right? So we need to add exact there, and we'll convert this back to the home route. And one more thing that I wanted to mention is the syntax for this exact prop. You might have expected us to have to say exact equals true or, exact equals true in quotation marks or something like that. But basically, what React allows us to do when we want to say that a given prop is either true or false, it allows us to either pass that prop just like this without any equals sign after it, and this is the same as if we were to say exact equals true. And if we wanted to set exact to false, all we do is leave that prop off. Okay, so it's just kind of a shorthand way for passing Boolean props in React. That's just something I wanted to point out here because I don't think we've talked about it yet. Cool, so that should fix the weird behavior that we were seeing. So now when we go to /user profile, we should see the user profile page, and we don't see the friends page anymore. So the other thing, let's check out our friend detail page. That's going to be at /friends/ some ID, so 123 or 234 or whatever. If we go to one of those, we're going to see that it says I'm the friend detail page. Okay, so those are the 3 pages for our application, and that is the basics of implementing routing in React. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing. Okay, so now that we have 3 different pages for our application, the next thing that I want to show you how to do is create a nav bar, right? Generally, as a general rule, the users of our application are not going to want to navigate around our application by typing in URLs up at the top of their browser, right? So we're going to create just a basic nav bar that will allow users to navigate between the pages of our application. So here's what our nav bar is going to look like. We're going to start off by creating a separate component for our nav bar. So let's put that inside our source directory. We're going to say new file, navbar.js. And inside here, we're going to define the navbar component. So we're going to say, first of all, we're going to import a component from the React Router DOM package. This is similar to Browser Router and Route, those 2 components that we imported from React Router DOM earlier. But this component is called link, all right? You might be able to guess what it does, but we'll get there when we get there. So let's say import link from React Router DOM. And the other thing we're going to do is add styles. So let's just generate a new navbar.module.css file inside here. We're going to say navbar.module.css, hit enter, and we'll import those styles inside our navbar component. So let's say import styles from ./navbar.module.css. Okay, so now to define our navbar. It's going to be a pretty simple component. We're just going to say const navbar equals, and then inside here what we're going to do is return, and we're going to have a nav element here. It's just a semantic HTML element that will make it easier for screen readers to find the navigation bar. And inside here, we're going to add both an H1 heading, right? So this is going to be essentially the branding of our site, right? So it's going to be the thing up in the top left corner, right? It'll look something like this. It's going to have, friend tracker in big letters. Obviously, it'll look better than that, but you get the point. So let's head back here and just add some text to this H1 heading. We're going to say friend tracker. So it's just going to be the name of our app. You'll see that we'll add some styling that will make it look really good. And the other element that we're going to have inside our nav bar is going to be a button. This is going to be over at the left-hand side once we add our styles. And it's going to say my profile. So it's going to be a button over at the left-hand side here that will basically allow the user to go to their profile. Okay, so that will take them to the user profile page, essentially. Okay, so we have these 2 elements, but they're kind of lacking in functionality, right? Currently, they're not going to actually do anything when the user clicks on them. And that's where this link component that we imported up at the top comes in. Basically, this is how in React we link to another page inside our application. So what that's going to look like, the link component takes one prop called to, and you might be able to guess what that prop specifies. It specifies what route the user will be taken to if they click this link. So we're going to say link to, and for this H1 heading here, we're going to have that take the user to the home page, right? The friends page, that is. So we're going to say link to, and we're going to put that friend tracker heading inside of there, okay? And we're going to have another link underneath that for the My Profile button. We're going to say link to, and that's going to take the user to the user profile page like that. And we're going to put the button inside there. Now, you might be wondering why we used a link for the button instead of using the button's on-click prop. And the reason for that is really just ease of use, right? I personally find it easier to navigate the user to another page using a link instead of actually adding, on click equals blah, blah, blah. And we don't even know how to navigate the user programmatically yet. That is something we'll take a look at later on. So that's the reason we're using the link for the button, is just because for the time being, it's easier and it serves all our needs. Okay, so Last up, let's export our navbar. We're going to say export navbar. And we'll see how to add it to our application. But first, let's actually add some styles to this navbar. So first of all, we're going to want to style the navbar itself, right? We're going to want to make sure that the entire bar across the top of our application looks pretty good. So we're going to create a class here called navbar. And this is just going to determine the layout of both the H1 heading and the button inside the navbar. So we're going to say align items. Let's try typing that again. Align items center. Under that, we're going to say display flex. Under that, we're going to say justify content space between. This will basically make sure that all of the elements inside our navbar are spaced horizontally as far apart from each other as possible. So, you know, the H1 heading will be in the upper left-hand corner. The button will be in the upper right-hand corner. And underneath that, and then we're going to say padding, and we're going to give it 0 padding in one direction and 16 pixels of padding in the other direction. Okay, so that's our navbar. We'll add these style names to our elements in our component in just a minute. But first, we're going to define the site heading style. This is going to be that H1 heading, that big bold branding up in the left-hand corner of our application. So first of all, what we want to do is make the color black. Okay. We're going to set the display to inline block so that it doesn't force the button onto another line. Then we're going to say font size. We're going to make the font size a little bigger than normal. We're going to say 30 pix, right? It's the branding of our site, so we got to make it fairly large. Under that, we're going to say text transform uppercase. That's going to convert all of the letters in the H1 heading to capital letters. And then we're going to say padding for pix, okay? So the other thing that we're going to want to do with this site heading, if you recall what it looked like when I first showed it to you, when I showed you the completed application, we're going to want to have a nice line above and below the name of our site. So that'll look something like this, right? If we have friend tracker like that, right? I'm just going to write out friend. We're going to want to have cool lines above and below. Just makes it a little more graphically pleasing, to my eye anyway. If you don't like it, don't do it. But the way that we can do that in CSS is by basically just adding a thick border to the top and bottom of our heading. So we can say border bottom. We're going to say 2 pix solid black. And border top, we're going to also say 2 pix solid black. Okay, so that's our site heading. The last thing we need to do is add our profile button. So we're just going to say profile button. And the only style we're going to need for this is float right. So that will basically just make it sit where we want it, right in the right-hand side of the navbar. So let's go into our navbar component now and add these styles to the appropriate elements. What we're going to do is the nav element here is going to have the class name of navbar. So class name equals styles.navbar. The H1 heading here, of course, is going to have the class name of site heading. So class name equals styles.siteHeading. And for the button, we're going to say class name equals styles.profileButton. Okay, so that's our navbar. Let's display it in our app component now. Now, one thing to note about the navbar is that we're going to want it to be displayed across all pages. So no matter what route the user is currently on, we're going to want them to see it. Now, there might be certain exceptions to this, right? If the user, maybe on the login page, we don't want to show the user the navbar because they can't go to their profile yet, and they also can't see their friends page yet. So there might be exceptions to this, but in general, we're going to want the navbar to show up on all the pages. So here's how we're going to do that. We're going to say import navbar from navbar. And down here, we're going to display the navbar outside all of the routes. That's basically how we make certain elements on our page display no matter what route we're on. So with the navbar, if our site has any headers or footers and we want them to be displayed on all pages regardless of the route, all we have to do is display those outside our route components. So let's go take a look now at what our navbar looks like. And sure enough, it looks pretty darn good in my opinion. And when we click on the My Profile button, it takes us to the user profile page. When we click on Friend Tracker, it takes us to the Friends page. Now the Friend Detail page, remember, we don't need a specific link for that because we're going to want that to happen whenever we click on a specific friend in our friends list. We'll get there pretty soon. So that's our nav bar. One other thing that I wanted to discuss with you before we move on is you might be wondering why we used this link component instead of just using the basic anchor tag, right, with an href attribute. Well, the difference here, and there is a pretty large difference, is here. Let me just show you what will happen if instead of that we use an anchor tag. So I'm going to change this to anchor, I'm going to change this to href, and I'm going to change this to anchor again. So we'll change both of these. Href equals and anchor. Okay, so if we go back to our page now and click on the headings up at the top, we're going to see that whenever we do that, the page refreshes, right? You see this little spinner. It comes up very quickly, so it's kind of hard to see, but the little spinner shows up showing that we're reloading the entire site whenever we navigate using the anchor tag. Now, the reason that this happens has to do with how the internet worked a while ago, right? Before we had single-page applications and libraries like React, right? Earlier, let's say back in the 1990s, if you had a site, right, and that site had 3 pages, you would actually have 3 separate HTML documents. And if you wanted to link those pages to each other, you would have that anchor tag inside of one. And if you clicked on that, your browser would actually load the document that it was referencing, okay? So that's why when we use the anchor tag, as we saw, it causes our site to refresh, because what the anchor tag tells our browser is that it needs to load a different document entirely. Now, because of the way React works, this is not actually the case. So what the link component does then is it makes it so that the page does not refresh, but it looks like we're actually going to a different page within our application. So if we change this back to link now, right, we're going to change all those back to link to, we'll see that when we click on these things, we navigate to a different page, but our application doesn't actually refresh. Okay, so all that's happening when we navigate in React, let's delete that there. All that's happening when we navigate between pages of our application in React is basically removing all of the contents of one page. So if we navigate from the Friends page to the user profile page, React is removing this stuff here, and it's going to insert the contents of the user profile page into the DOM in its place. So in other words, it looks to the user like we're actually changing between different pages, but all React is doing is removing some elements from the DOM and replacing that with other elements, okay? Now, one thing to note as well with this is that the link component we only really want to use when we're linking inside our application, okay? So if we're linking to an external site, if we're linking to Google, let's say, then you'll still want to use an anchor tag because you actually do have to load another page, right? You have to load another index.html page from that site's server. Okay, so that's the link component in React, and that's how we create a basic nav bar for our application. I hope this has been informative, and I'd like to thank you for viewing. Okay, now that we've got the nav bar and the routes set up for our application, what we're going to do now is go through and implement each of these pages that we've set up for ourselves. So the first one we're going to do is the Friends page, and this one's going to be the easiest because it's pretty much just going to involve copying and pasting all of the former logic that we were keeping inside our app component here. Okay, so everything that we commented out earlier, we're basically going to uncomment and cut and paste into our Friends page. The first thing, though, that I want to do is actually create some kind of wrapper that can go around each of our pages that will constrain it to a certain width on the screen and make each of them look good. The current styling that we have will basically let them spread out all across the browser. So in order to do that, all we have to do is wrap this in a div with the class name of content container. So we're going to say class name equals styles.contentContainer. And for this, we're going to have to actually uncomment the styles import up here. Okay, so we're going to uncomment that. We're going to say styles.contentContainer. And inside this div, we're going to put all of the routes that we created. This will basically make whatever component the route ends up displaying constrained inside this div here. Okay, and you can see that we have this content container thing that we created earlier, which was doing pretty much what I just described there, right? It was containing all of the contents of our friend tracker application. Okay, so now that we've done that, let's do what I just said and move everything into the friends page from the app component. So we're basically just going to do this section by section and uncomment it. So we're going to need use state. We're going to take all of these things here and move them into the friends page. And we might have to adjust some of these imports as well, since friends page is in a different directory than the app component was. So we're going to have to change all of these to actually point to the correct files when we get there. And next up, let's go down here. We're going to take all of this stuff that used to be our entire application and put it in our friends page right underneath where we had the heading. So we're going to remove this heading because it's obviously a little useless, and we're also going to remove the return statement here. And then we're going to uncomment all of this and see where we're at. Okay, so we're going to uncomment those, and if you open up the terminal where our app is actually running, this is going to actually give us a pretty nice way to find out where we went wrong with our imports. So first of all, we see that it can't resolve people list, right? And that's because people list is not inside this pages directory, right? That's sort of what we're expecting when we say it like this. So what we could do is correct this. Oops. Okay, let's try that again. Now what we could do is correct this and say // people list, and that would be pretty much what we're looking for, right? That would just tell it to look in the directory one up from the current directory. But what we're going to do first is take all of our components like people list, person card, tag, welcome message, etc., and put it into its own directory, which we'll call components. Okay, so what we're doing here is we're creating sort of a natural division between the pages of our application, which are sort of the big containers that have most of the logic for our application in them, and the actual components that we can rearrange and display on each of those pages. So this is how I usually tend to prefer organizing things in smaller applications. Once our application gets a little bigger, I'll show you one alternative to this. But for now, let's just say components. And what we're going to do is put several of our most important components in there. We're going to put our navbar in there. Okay, so let's move navbar module. We're also going to move people list and people list module into there, as well as person card module, and profile info, I believe we also want in there as well. Yep, so those two. And we also want tag module, welcome message, and welcome message module. So basically everything except for our app component, we're going to move into this components folder. And we're basically going to load them all from there. So this is going to break a lot of our exports, but we'll go through and fix those as well. Okay, so let's go back into our friends page here, and we'll start off with that one. We're going to say / components / people list, and we'll do the same thing with profile info, / components / profile info, and / components / welcome message. Oh, and it looks like one more import that we missed is going to be this data.js file. Let's put that in components as well. Or, you know what, let's actually leave that out in source, since that's more of an app level thing. And what we'll do is just have our friends page right here. We'll have that change where it's importing it from. So we'll just change that to .. /data. Okay, and the next thing we're going to do is inside our friends page, we need the styles. Most of those styles were in the app component, so let's just take a look here and see what styles we're expecting to have. So we had styles.content container, styles.content heading. It looks like the content heading one is the only one we need because we no longer actually need the content container, because that's going to be displayed inside the route, so we can remove that. And this friend tracker heading, remember that we put that directly inside our navbar here, so we don't need that anymore either. So we can remove that. And it looks like the only style we need now is going to be the styles.content heading. So let's just move that from our app component. I don't think we need it in here anymore. It doesn't look like it. So let's open up app.module.css, cut content heading, and we're going to put that in our friends page styles. Now, we don't actually have a file for that, so let's create that here. We're going to say friends page.module.css. Inside there, we're going to paste that code. Oops, that code is what we want. And then inside our friends page, we're going to have to, of course, import that file. So we'll say import styles from ./friendspage.module.css. All right, so let's see where we're at. It looks like everything is compiled successfully. We don't have any more import errors for the time being. So let's take a look at our friends page, and sure enough, we see that it looks pretty nice. Right? It's it's still displaying my profile, and we're going to actually move this into the user profile page in a minute. But basically everything else is here, right? We have this welcome message here, and we have our friends and favorites list. So let's actually move this, my profile thing, into the user profile page. That's going to be pretty simple as well. What we're going to do is open up user profile page. We're going to copy that part of the JSX from our friends page over into there. So let's see, it's just profile info person equals my profile data. So let's copy that. Oh, here we also want to copy the H2 heading. So let's cut both of those out, put them in the user profile page right underneath this heading, which we don't need anymore. And we're going to wrap those in a fragment. Okay, and of course we're also going to have to import profile info from our components folder. So /components/profile info. And we're going to import that content heading style. Two things we can really do, right? One would be to just import it straight from the friends page CSS, but that's usually not a good practice. So what we're going to do is just write another module file where we say user profile page.module.css, hit enter, and we're going to copy and paste this content heading thing into user profile page CSS. Now, it's not necessarily the best practice to be duplicating styles all over the place, so what we might want to do if we were really going to be strict about it is move this content heading style into index.css, right? It's something that we're using all over our app, so it would kind of make sense to do that, but for the time being, we're just going to leave it, right? It's something that we'll leave for another day. Okay, so in our user profile page now, let's import those styles from our user profile page .module, or user profile page.module.css, just like that. And let's take a look at our user profile page now. Oops, we need my profile data first, it looks like, so let's import that as well. That was in the data file, so we'll say import my profile data from /data. All right, let's check this out now. So we can see that our user profile page is no longer on our friends page, which is great. And our friends page is working just like we want it to. And we can also hide this thing if we want to. So let's click on my profile here. And sure enough, we see that our profile is displayed very nicely inside the user profile page. Okay, so now that we've implemented our user profile and friends pages, the next page that we need to implement is the friend detail page. So remember that I said when we click on one of these friends, we want that to take us to a page that will show them more details about them. Now, the component that we're going to be using for this friend detail page is the same one that we've used to display our own profile here, but because we've made it reusable through props, we're just going to be able to pass in the information for basically any user in our application or any of our friends in our application, and we'll have that automatically displayed just like we want it. Now, there are two tricky parts in this. The first one is actually taking advantage of the URL parameters that I talked about earlier. So in other words, we want to go to friends234 and have that display the friend with ID 234. Now, to do this, we're going to need to use some special hooks, which I'll show you in just a minute. But the second challenging thing is basically right now, right, we have it so that when you click on our friends, it changes whether they're a favorite or not. So we're going to need to figure out a way to do that, and as you'll see, what we'll do is basically allow ourselves to pass in multiple prop functions and add a button to each of our friends that will allow us to change whether they're a favorite or not. You'll see what I mean when we get there. For now, let's just focus on first loading the correct friend for our friend detail page. So remember that the first thing that we had to do here, which we've already done, is inside our app.js component, right where we've defined all of the routes for our application, we have the path for our friend detail page looking something like this, right? We have this :friend ID thing, which, as I mentioned earlier, is a URL parameter. That's how we specify URL parameters in React. So basically what we need to do now is inside this friend detail page, we need to access the current value of this part of the URL and use that to display the correct friend from our friends data in our data file. So let's open up our friend detail page here. And the first thing that we're going to do is import our friends data from the data file. So we'll say import friends data from data. And I'm just going to change these to single quotes. I'm not sure why that puts double quotes whenever I autocomplete it. And we're also going to import our profile info component that we're using to display our own profile. So we're going to say import profile info from components profile info. Okay, so now let's remove this I'm the friend detail page. Obviously, that's not what we want the page to say. And we're going to replace this with the profile info component, but we need to basically decide which friend from our friends data here we want to display. I'll show you how to do that in just a minute here. So we're going to say profile info, and we're going to need to pass a person prop to this at some point, but we don't know what that is yet. Okay, so our friends data here, which again is just an array of objects that represent our friends, basically what we need to do is select the friend from this array whose ID, as I've said, matches the URL parameter. Now, the next question is, how do we get the value of the URL parameter? Well, this is going to be done using something called the useParams hook. Okay, this is a React hook which we import from the React Router DOM package here. So we're going to say import useParams React Router DOM. And the way that we get the params, here, what I'm going to do is just show you what this will look like. I'm going to say const params equals useParams. And what I'm going to do for now is just log those out so you can see what those look like. Okay, so what we're going to do is now head over, and for this, we'll just, I guess, remove this for now and go back to displaying the H1 heading here for now so that it doesn't cause an error. So let's go back and take a look at our friend detail page and see what we just logged out. So let's open up our inspector window, take a look at the console here, and we're going to go to that page that I had typed in. And sure enough, what we'll see is that params is an object that contains the key, which is basically the string that we defined inside the route's path, and the current value of that section of the URL, right? So friends ID is 234 here. So this should actually make it pretty easy for us. And to access the friend ID, you can do one of two things. You can either say const friend ID equals params.friendID, or if you're like me and you think that that's kind of repetitive, what you're going to do is say const and use object destructuring here to get the friend ID from the params. Either one works, so just pick whichever one you're comfortable with, I suppose. So the next thing we need to do is find the friend in our friend's data whose ID matches this that we just got from the URL params. So here's how we'll do that. What we're going to do is say const selected friend equals friends data, and then we're going to say friends data.find. Now this function is used to basically find the first element in an array that matches a given criteria. Okay, so basically what we pass to this function is going to be a function that returns true or false for each element. So for each friend in our friends data, we're going to want to return whether or not their ID property equals the friend ID that we got from the URL parameters. Okay, so that's our selected friend. And what we're going to do now is display our profile info component with that selected friend as our prop. So we'll say person, that is, equals selected friend. And that is all we need to do. Cool, so that's our profile info. Let's take a look and see if everything works so far. So sure enough, if we go to friends/234, we see our friend Carl Hill, who's being displayed. If we try and go to a different one, like 123, hit enter, we'll see Eva Hayes. And if we go to 345, we'll see Erica Gregory. And again, yours might be different, right? If you decided to use different friend names and whatnot, then you will see different people. But the point is here that our friend detail page is working very nicely so far. So the next thing we're going to do is we need to actually make sure that when we go to /friends/ID, that friend exists. Because if that friend doesn't exist, right, if we put in an ID that doesn't exist, it will actually cause our app to crash because we'll be trying to access properties on null from this person inside our profile info. So the way that we can do that, very simple way, is by just checking to see if the selected friend exists. We're going to use a ternary operator here and say return selected friend. And if that friend exists, we're going to display the profile info. Otherwise, what we're going to do is say something here. I'm basically just going to come up with a little sort of 404 page, if you will. And this will say paragraph. We'll say, oops, couldn't find that friend. And under that, basically we'll just have a link back to the home page. All right, so pretty user-friendly little 404 page here. We're going to say link. We're going to link the user back to the home page by saying link to /. And inside here, we'll say button back to home. All right, so what we'll see now, if we go back, we'll see, oops, couldn't find that friend, back to home. Cool. And that will, of course, take us back to our homepage. All right, so really the last thing that we have to do here in order to complete this whole flow of clicking on our friends and going to the friend detail page is make it so that when we click on one of our friends, they go to the friend detail page. So the way that we're going to do that is basically, as I said, we're going to replace the current functionality of clicking on them and having them go to favorites. We're going to replace that with having them go to the friend detail page. So here's what this is going to look like. We're going to basically open up the friend card component. So let's open that up in here, or person card component rather. So what we're going to do is open up our person card component, and really we're not going to change too much in here. The reason that I wanted to show you this is because your first inclination as to how to make the user navigate to the friend detail page when they click on a person card is probably something along the lines of importing the link component from React Router DOM, and then simply wrapping this entire thing in a link to the corresponding friend's route. So we would say link to, and then we would use backticks here and say /friends/ID. Okay, we would insert that ID property here, and then simply wrap the entire div inside of that. Okay, so that's probably your first instinct with how to do this at this point, because I haven't really showed you any alternatives. So let's just take a look at what that actually does to our friends. First of all, we see that it adds this nasty blue or purple link styling to each of these friends, although it does actually work for bringing us to their corresponding pages, right? If we click on Carl Hill, if we click on Eva Hayes, if we click on Erica Gregory, it brings us to their page, and as we can see, it's also currently adding them to our favorites as well, because we haven't removed that functionality yet. So that's the first problem with using a link here, is that it basically applies styling that we don't want. But the second problem has to do with reusability of components again. If you haven't caught on that that's a very important topic in React, then I've got some news for you. It is. So the second problem here, as I said, is reusability. Now the current way that we're using our person card components, using a link makes perfect sense. However, if we think ahead, there will probably be a lot of situations where we don't want to actually link the person to the corresponding friend detail page when they click on one of these things, right? I'm not going to go into too much detail on just some of the situations where we might want to do that. But, maybe if we wanted to change the friend's color when we click on them in order to indicate they're a favorite or something like that in some other context, that would be something we'd want to do. The point here is that we're not always going to want to link our person card to the detail page. And adding a link here basically constrains us to that. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to leave our person card component exactly as it was before. Okay? Now, what we're going to do instead is we're going to tap into this onClick event that's bubbling up through to our friends page, and we're going to use that instead to navigate to the friend detail page. So let's open up our people list here, and we're going to see that onClick person is just being passed up from our person card. We don't need to make any changes here. Where we do need to make changes is inside our friends page itself. Okay, if you take a look here at our people list, we see that we're listening for onClick person from both our favorites people list and our non-favorites people list. And here is where we need to actually call a different function other than toggle favorite. Okay, so we're going to leave toggle favorite for now because we will be using it again later. But what we're going to do is add another function called go to person detail. Okay, and this is going to take, just like toggle favorite, it's going to take the person's ID that we clicked on in the list. So person ID. And what it's going to do is it's going to navigate the user programmatically to the person detail page. Now, we haven't seen how to do this yet, but it does not involve using the link component. Instead, it involves using another hook that we're going to import from the React Router DOM package called useHistory. So basically what this hook allows us to do is tap into functionality that will allow us to, send the user automatically to another route with code instead of with a link component. So let's import useHistory from React Router DOM. And the way that we actually use this thing is anywhere inside our component, we can say const history equals useHistory, like that. And now we're going to scroll down, and inside go to person detail, all we have to do is say history.push and tell it where we want to go. So we're going to use backticks here and send the user to /friends/$person ID. And now we just need to pass go to person detail to our people list components instead of toggle favorite. Okay, so go to person detail and go to person detail. All right. So what you're going to see now is if we go back here and click on our people, it takes us directly there without even making any changes to our person card components. Okay, so what you can see is that this makes the person card component that much more reusable, because in order to change what happens when you click on one of those people, literally all you have to do is change the function that you're passing in way up in the page component. So you could have multiple pages that have different things happen when the user clicks on each of those cards, and you wouldn't have to have separate cards. You could have a single component that handles all of that. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.